Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We have problem solvers from around the globe joining us as we kick off our 2020 virtual International Conference for Future Problem Solving. We have spent months adjusting to a virtual format. We opened our 3D virtual platform 5 hours ago. There are problem solvers who are navigating through looking at projects, looking at our sponsors, and chatting with each other from all over the world. I was on a little while ago. We had Portuguese and English speakers interacting and chatting with each other. The universal language of high fives and dance moves was alive and well on our platform. My name is April Mickley. I'm the Executive Director of Future Problem Solving Program International. With me, I have Elizabeth Coyle. She is our Program Director, and we are honored, excited to welcome Lisa Kay Solomon as the keynote address speaker for this year's International Conference. Lisa is a best-selling author. She is an educator, and she is a designer in residence at the Stanford Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. She has dedicated her career to ensure that futurist skills are teachable and learnable. She argues they are the most important leadership skills that all students can and should learn to create the future we all want to be a part of. We are very pleased to have Lisa with us. We believe in her work. She is beyond excited to hear the action plans that our students are going to create and develop in the coming days. And now in 2020, more than ever, we all know that we need to accept and love and learn each other for the best possible tomorrow that we can all create. Thank you for being with us, Lisa. We are very excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Wonderful, April. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who is joining this call. I could not be more excited. I just love the work that you're doing. And the moment that I learned that there was an organization, a global organization that was focused on helping give our students a chance to think more critically, more creatively about the future, I could not get involved fast enough. So it's truly an honor to be here with all of you. And I know that everyone has had to flex their futurist skills quite rapidly in the last 10 weeks to adjust to this new format. So super grateful to be a part of this. I've asked April to chime in here. I'm going to be sharing some ideas with you for the next 45 minutes or so, but I want to hear from you. So we have the chat going. We're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. I know there are a lot of students on here, and it's nice to see where you're calling in from all around the country and out of the country, all the countries. Australia's in the house, so continue to encourage you to share where you're calling in from so we can invest in this community of practice of futurists and educators who support futurists. As April said, that is the heart of my work. That has been the heart of my work for the last 20 years. And if we think about who is really going to shape the future, it is our youth. It is our students. So the work we are doing here is so, so vital. So I'm going to share my screen, which is always the moment of horror for anyone who does presentations now virtually. So fingers crossed that here we go, that this will all work out. All right, hopefully you're seeing my slide that said leader as futurist. All right. As I mentioned, and April sort of shared it, my heart and passion is to support young people feeling like they have the skills to shape the future that they want to see come to life. If we think about where most of our K-12 humanities teaching is as it relates to the future, it's kind of ironic in that it sits in history classes. And while we know that history and understanding patterns of history is critical to helping people think creatively and constructively about the future, I might argue it is not enough, because while history is so critical to our understanding of how we can imagine a wide variety of futures, we actually cannot influence history. We can only influence the future. So I'm on a mission, and I want everyone on this call to join me students and educators alike, to commit to bringing futures to schools everywhere, not just as a club, but as a core curriculum. So I believe that you are so ahead of the curve. And lately, in this moment of extreme disruption, I've been asked a lot specifically to work with heads of schools and to help support administrators who are trying to understand what will fall look like for them. And one of the number one recommendations I am making is you have to bring futures programming, you have to bring futures mindset, you have to bring a futures curriculum into your school. So yes, we are going to work on plans for the future about how we are going to teach, but it is more important for us to think about what is our responsibility to help our students learn, and how do they adapt, and how do they feel comfortable navigating the inevitable continued uncertainty that they are going to face. They will have to learn how to be problem solvers in a world that is filled with more uncertainty, more volatility, more complexity, and more ambiguity. And we are seeing that now more than ever. So I just want to start off by applauding the work that you are doing and really celebrating it. I'm going to start with a poll. So we're going to see if this poll works. And what I want to do is get a quick snapshot of your worldview of the future. So I think I have polling opportunity here to launch, but I'm going to ask my friends in Mission Control to help me if this doesn't work here. But I'd like you to answer 2 questions for me. And this is related to where you are sitting in response to how you're thinking about the future. So I want to understand, as you think ahead 25 years, not in this current moment, but 25 years ahead, so we have a chance to kind of get through this moment. How are you feeling generally about the future? So the first question is, am I feeling relatively optimistic about the future? I think that 25 years from now, we're going to be sitting in a better place than we are today. Or instead, am I thinking, nope, I'm really not feeling good about the trends that we're headed? So I want you to just take a moment and reflect on that. And then the second question I have for you is, do you believe that the future will be primarily shaped by individual agency? Perhaps that is individual agency that you hold as a future leader. Or do you believe that outside forces are going to be primarily shaping our future? Certainly we are seeing, for example, right now, Corona as a great example of an outside force that is dramatically shaping at least our near-term future. So think about these 2 questions. What is your general worldview of the future? More leaning towards optimistic or pessimistic? And what is your sense of what will shape the future, individual agency or outside forces? So I'm going to check in with my Mission Control here. Are you seeing the results?
We are.
Okay, you are. Okay, great. So I'm going to give it just another 20 seconds or so. I know folks are coming in. So I'm encouraged. Yes, go ahead.
We do have some guests on Facebook who are recording their answers and the comments there as well. So we are getting excellent input both from the Zoom poll and in comments on Facebook. So excellent participation.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Because listen, the future is an active sport. It's not a passive sport. So we are in general, hopefully you are seeing what I'm seeing, at least on the Zoom poll, we are weighted towards optimists, which is a great thing, particularly given that you are either in the education business or you are a student looking ahead at a longer future. And that is exciting to see that this moment that is very difficult for many people is not stopping you from feeling like we might be able to get through it, that there is a future ahead of us that feels brighter than perhaps where we are right now. And what's interesting is that we seem to have a slightly more even split around, do we believe that individual agency is going to dictate the future or outside forces? So for those of you that have already answered, I'd love to maybe ask you to share in the chat, why did you pick what you picked?
We do also have 1 pessimistic and 1 optimistic on Facebook.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to end the poll right now. Looks like most people have answered. So we're definitely weighted in this crowd towards a bit more optimistic. And notice, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. Notice that there is a lot to be learned about where it is that you stand. This is not good or bad. You are not better if you believe that the world is more optimistic, or worse if you don't. You are taking a moment to check in with your personal worldview about how you feel about the future, because it is something that we often don't pause to take advantage of. And then we make decisions with that as a backdrop that we're not even aware of. So I'm going to end the poll here and I'm going to continue on. So thank you for that. So you all saw the results, is that right? This is where we landed in case.
Yep, we can see results.
Great.
Sorry, there's a little bit of an echo here.
All
There
right.
is a couple of other optimistic and outside forces on Facebook as well.
Great. Terrific. Well, maybe you have realized that in answering that, you actually participated in a human virtual 2x2. And so maybe you could sort of take a moment to pause on your answers to situate yourself in one of these quadrants. Now, this is not a statistically significant qual metrics certified end result of your choice. This is just a general sense of perhaps how you are thinking about the future. So if you think, for example, that the future is relatively optimistic and that we can bet on agency, individual agency, you might see yourself as a future shaper, as someone that is capable of making choices to help bring a more optimistic future to life. If you see yourself in the upper left, where the future is optimistic, but outside forces, perhaps you're not feeling that you might be in a place to shape the future, but you are still going to engage in it with perhaps a more discovery mindset. On the bottom left, if you think of outside forces primarily driving and the future is generally pessimistic, you might think that the future is happening to you, that you might not have as much agency to be able to change it. And in the bottom right, the future pessimistic, and that you have agency, you might think of yourself as a savior, that you're going after the future to change it. I want to again suggest that there are no right or wrong answers. And oftentimes when we run this, we do this by physically, when we were able to gather, placing ourselves in a live 2x2 so we could literally look at someone else and ask them with curiosity, why did you choose to pick that spot? One of the classes that I teach at Stanford is a class called Inventing the Future, where we spend the entire quarter practicing futures practices and creativity practices against the backdrop of emerging technologies and some driving forces changing our future. We start the class with this activity and we end the class with this activity to try to understand what might it take to help us feel like we have more agency in the future in shaping it. And what do we believe that we are paying attention to that might drive our individual perspectives? So for example, someone might feel climate change as more urgent and therefore might put outside forces on as something that they prioritize. And someone else might see and pay attention to some of the stories of innovation that are happening and moments where we have actually shifted our future trajectory because of choices we have made to try to bring something new to life that benefits many people. All this is to say is we are expanding surface area about our implicit biases that we believe about the future in order to make sure we are accessing them as we come up with new ideas for the future, that we're not getting blindsided by something that we didn't see, and we are able to access the diversity of perspectives. This comes from some incredible work from Fred Pollock, who was a Dutch philosopher who was actually a Holocaust survivor. He was hidden in a family's home during World War II and had a lot of time to think and shape his worldview about what he believed that would create a society that could thrive in the future. He wrote many things, including this 800-page tome called The Image of the Future. And in this, which was published in about 1961, so he had a little bit of time to process his experience and his studies, he really came to the belief that the rise and fall of images of the future, how we believe our future to be, was very much connected to our cultural perspective of what could be. That the culture, that the society needs to believe in what you might call an optimistic narrative, that they might actually have agency in bringing that a better future to life that will then have an important impact on the choices that they make to help create a fulfilling prophecy of bringing that future to life. And on the flip side, if a society feels that too much negativity is embedded in the culture, that makes it much more difficult for the culture to thrive. So notice that we're not predicting the future here, but we are acknowledging that there is a direct connection between our beliefs and then the choices that we make in order to shape our future. So this is incredibly important foundational work from one of the sort of grandfathers of futures thinking, Fred Pollack. So the work that I do is a combination of futures thinking and design thinking. In essence, asking ourselves, what are the teachable and learnable disciplines, the mindsets, the skills and practices that will help us understand a wide range of futures and how they might unfold. So how does understanding futures better inform our changing context so that we can make better decisions today on behalf of more people, on behalf of our communities? So futures allows us to understand futures through a lens of creative and critical thinking, and design allows us to make choices that positively impact the people that we want to serve. So hopefully many of you on the call have had some exposure to design thinking, to human-centered design, that asks us to apply a discipline to understand what is happening in the lives of people that we want to better serve, so that we can then go through an iterative learning process to bring new ideas to life. So I believe these disciplines are critical to helping leaders feel like that they can be both generative in the face of rising uncertainty and resilient. And I know you know that because that's what you've been doing. So I do this work, as April said, at the Stanford D School. We make a lot of our materials public, so I hope you've read. If you haven't had a chance to visit, I know there are a lot of educators on the call. We have an incredible K-12 program. And in fact, we are leaning hard into scenario planning and futures. So this is a wonderful opportunity and invitation for you to come and participate in some of the new work we are bringing to life. For the students on the call, we also have a lot of programs. Unfortunately, usually in the summer, we have a high school program, but we hope that will resume again soon. And I encourage you all to come and visit. It's a pretty special place on Stanford's campus where we do a lot of experiential learning with this very much belief in mind that we are dedicated to learning, to practicing the skills that will enable you to develop creative confidence, to go after these tricky problems. So my focus is on asking things like, what do we think is inevitable? How do we better understand the difference between elements that are predetermined in our future? And how do we get better at understanding the uncertainties so we can track them more closely and perhaps make choices to influence them in positive ways? How do we cultivate empathy for the future? How do we ensure that we're not just looking at the future through the lens of forecast, but we understand that it's in fact individuals who will be living in that future, that have emotion and needs that we could better understand? And how do we understand the power dynamics of the future? And this is such an important moment right now for us to examine who has access to shaping the future. How can we expand that access to make sure we are in fact bringing about a future that is equitable and that allows everyone to flourish in ways that allow them to be their best selves on behalf of their community and the larger world? I fundamentally believe that while there are no facts about the future, and anyone that tells you that they know exactly how the future is going to play out, by this point you should have an eyebrow raised. You are experienced enough to say, that's interesting, let's learn more, let's talk about that. There are no facts about the future, and this is something I say a lot to executives that I work with. The future doesn't care about your strategic plan. I know you spent a lot of time working on it, but just because you have a spreadsheet and a sensitivity analysis does not mean you are guaranteed to have that future come to life. But how we feel about the future, our hopes, our dreams, our expectations are very much available to us today. And if we spend time imagining a wider range of futures and how they play out, and we give ourselves the ability to immerse ourselves in potential futures, we will be that much more informed to make better decisions, to be less blindsided by the surprises, and to double down on the things that will make us more resilient. At the D School, we lean in to 8 design abilities that we have been cascading throughout our classes. I want to share them with you here today because I think you will find a lot of resonance in what you've been experiencing in this competition, because these are design skills that are also futurist skills. So the ability to navigate ambiguity, to lean into a process without 100% knowing if it is going to be successful or not, or if you have the right answer or not, and to go forward anyway. To learn from others, people, and context. To experiment rapidly. To synthesize information, lots of different kinds of information, information that's qualitative, that is quantitative, to bring them together in powerful ways. To build and craft intentionally. And I love that you are doing a lot of your work in a 3D virtual world. That is a great example of crafting intentionally. To communicate deliberately, to be able to talk in not just numbers, but in narratives and stories to bring futures to life. To move between concrete and abstract. So much of our work is making the future tangible so that others can understand and join us for the learning journey. And to design our design work, to recognize that many people are not comfortable talking about the future, not because they're not capable of it, but because they haven't been given time to practice. How do we create safe conditions for others to join us in these explorations? How do we ensure that we are allowing people to bring their contribution forward because the process itself was so welcoming and so inclusive? This is exactly what you have been doing on behalf of this Futures Challenge, the future of terraforming. And when I read this description, this was the sentence that really captured my attention. What unforeseen effects and consequences might these actions create? This is very much the genesis of what started the class that I mentioned that I teach at Stanford called Inventing the Future. Because here I am calling in from Silicon Valley, where we love technology. And our first instinct generally is, can we build it? And our point of view is that perhaps the first question we should ask is, should we build it? How do we get ahead of understanding the consequences of technology that will dramatically impact our lives and those around us? Because we know that technology is scaling faster than our human capacity to understand it. And that a lot of the difficult questions we are experiencing now are a result of perhaps not having the foresight, not being willing to ask the question around unforeseen consequences. So right now we are seeing consequences, of course, around internet privacy, around data, around algorithms, around bias. That was before Corona. We are now seeing, of course, the implications of what happens with climate change and what happens and the potential for pandemics to spread because of some of the choices we've made. So we have an opportunity to get ahead of choices that don't just impact the next year, but impact generations to come. This is the work I have been doing. And this is a quote from the first book I wrote called Moments of Impact, which really articulates design as a leadership skill. And Moments of Impact is really a book about designing strategic conversations about the future, making the future's process more democratic, more inclusive, to suggest that any individual can understand what the future might hold, but we need to pull on the collective wisdom and perspective of others around us. And it turns out we've never been taught how to do that. Those of us that are working in industry, we've probably at some point been taught how to run a meeting, how to start things on time, end on time, and get to next steps. But you all know, because you've spent time asking questions about the future, we don't have knowable answers there. What are next steps for the future? That is an entirely different process that asks us to enter a discovery mode, a learning mode, a testing mode that happens through conversations. And so that's why I said, in a world filled with more volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, we need to think of ourselves like designers and futurists, and not like mechanics, where we're just taking a solution that worked in the past and we're tinkering it a little bit. We really need to ask a fundamental different question. We need to be comfortable disrupting the status quo. This is about leading in an age of ambiguity. And again, I want to suggest most of us are uncomfortable with ambiguity because we haven't been given time to practice it. I'm not saying ambiguity is ever comfortable, but our natural wired response is to freeze in the face of uncertainty. And that's not anybody's fault. It's because our DNA has been trained over thousands of years to not like uncertainty. Is that lion going to eat us or not? That puts us in a fear and threat response. It's only through time and practice that we can start to get more comfortable with coming up with a hypothesis of an unknown possibility and developing the pathways to better understand it. So I'm going to share a few ways that I see that we are able to teach how to navigate ambiguity, how to imagine better futures, how to make better choices today in order to serve our collective tomorrow. The first big bucket of skills that I believe we can learn is that around seeing the future. How do we see the future? This requires bold imagination, building anticipatory skills and long-term thinking, flexing our contextual intelligence. And many of you have been doing that, right? What is the future of terraforming? It requires you to be imaginative. It requires you to tap into some fantastical insights that maybe came from science fiction or from movies that you saw or some research on the cutting edge, right? Futurism is the art of reperception. It means recognizing that life will change, must change, and has changed, and suggest how and why. So you can take those inspirations and say, what would have to be true for this to actually happen? And, you know, this past weekend, we saw an extraordinary feat related to terraforming of the SpaceX-NASA partnership that docked in the International Space Center. That might have been a ridiculous thought 10 years ago, that a private industry would partner with NASA in order to fundamentally change the way we think about space travel. Why? It's because most of us think about what we know today. We are anchored in what is seen in front of us, and we project that out in the future. So 10 years ago, we would have said, only NASA could have done this, projecting out, right? Instead, thinking like a futurist suggests, what is the full range of possible futures? What are the probable futures? What are our preferred futures? And how do we better understand what might be possible today if we make different choices? And to first of all understand that the range of possible futures is different than the range of probable futures. Probable future starts to account for science. And our preferred future is embedded with our beliefs, our individual beliefs, which are different. And that is so important to understand, that our preferred future that we carry is different from somebody else's preferred future, which is why it is so wonderful that this program is so collaborative in its approach, so that you can start to unpack the wide range of preferred futures to make better choices together. One of the ways that we better see the future is to look at driving forces around us. This is the contextual intelligence to help us understand what are trends that are happening in the social arena, in demographic trends, intergenerational trends. What are trends happening on the technological side? And certainly we're seeing over the last 10 years a rise of exponential technologies, which is requiring us to flex imagination in extraordinary ways, particularly because of the convergence of these technologies. What's happening in the economic arena, and we've certainly seen tremendous change. What's happening environmentally, in climate change, and even what's been happening in the last 10 weeks of how climate change has been changed because of our change of behaviors driven by the pandemic. And what's happening in the political arena. So notice that these outside trends don't necessarily have a direct connection with any one organization, but by understanding them, by bringing in experts across these trends, we can be better informed about our assumptions and how robust they might be about the trends going forward. So we need to ask ourselves what is meaningfully uncertain and what might have a high impact. And we can see here again that those that have been very steeped in climate change have been feeling that in many ways this is actually not an uncertain inevitability, that this is in fact a predetermined fate, that if we don't change our behavior around climate change, it will negatively impact our future. And they've been trying to share stories, and it's only been recently in the last couple of years where we start to see the student voice getting involved. That it's really starting to have a policy impact, and that's just extraordinary. So this forces us and gives us the opportunity to take a driving force and start to imagine the unimaginable here. And I'm just going to share one of my favorite examples to see just how wide-ranging we can go by starting with something that is known and taking not a linear approach to how it might play out, but a fundamentally different approach. So let's start with the trend of driverless cars. Now, I have done this with thousands of people, and I can tell you I have not yet met somebody that thinks that driverless cars will not be a part of our future. The question is when, the question is what is the impact, and so how do we use our future's skills in order to imagine the wider range of possibilities just to explore. So, and how could we do that without judgment? So I'm just going to take what is in plain sight, the future of driverless cars, and I'm just going to create what's called a futures wheel to imagine the full range of possibilities just from this one exercise. And I say full range mostly because it's expansive, but it's by no means comprehensive. So if we take the future of driverless cars, well, we think there's going to be less accidents. Yeah, that's probably pretty reasonable. And if you were all with me, and maybe those of you on video, maybe you can give me a thumbs up if you think that's reasonable. Less accidents, less fatalities. We can have less organs that are available because there's less accidents and less organ donations that are readily available, which perhaps leads to, I don't know, a black market for organs. Perhaps it might lead to 3D printing organs. So I wonder how many of you would say, you know, driverless cars, I think that's going to lead to a rise in the black market of organ donation. No, but if you start to paint the path, you could say, oh, that's interesting. And then that's interesting. And then that's interesting. Again, we'll just play this out a little bit more. We can also imagine less accidents, less auto repair shops. We're already seeing that even with less driving. And from there, less accidents, cost of insurance. Insurance is a huge business, so they're paying attention to that. Less second car ownership, we're already seeing the implications of that. Less need to enforce the rules of the road. Who cares about that? Well, of course. Tax revenue, right? So again, in some ways, some of this is already playing out already. But are you thinking about it that way? Are you thinking about the fact that because there's less traffic tickets, that our municipalities are getting less local tax revenue? What does that mean? The need to stay awake? Well, who cares about that? I hope you're thinking about it in your head. Who cares about that? Yes, the demand for caffeine. The caffeine-infused beverage business has been huge, not just for students that need to stay up all night, but for truck drivers and those that are on long hauls. What would it do to that? How would Coke respond, or Red Bull? Increase in traffic flow, increase in speed limits. Well, what does that mean? That means that we get to places faster. And if you're Amtrak, or if you are your local rail, local rail organization, you're going to be paying attention to that, as is short haul airlines like Southwest Airlines. So all of these things might play out just from this one trend that we are seeing, driverless cars. This doesn't even begin to touch job loss and what's possible around delivery. Then we have an army of real-time data collectors on the roads all the time. What's the possibility there? Perhaps that is your next competition next year. You could talk to the organization about that. All this from just taking a simple trend that we can see and blowing it out. You could do this with anything, and you could do it quickly, and it quickly expands your range of how to see the future. Okay, how does this play out? Well, it helps you see the fringe. So a few years ago in California, we launched a plant-based burger that acts like a regular burger, the Impossible Burger. Maybe some of you have tried this already. And at first it was like, no, that's a California thing. That would never, ever fly in mainstream America, let alone globally. Sure enough, a few years later, when you start to see signals that some of the massive fast food companies are offering Impossible Burgers, you can no longer say that that is just a trend. This is how we learn to start to see signals differently, right? All of a sudden, your antenna is up, your peripheral vision for seeing that might have been a far-reaching edge development, all of a sudden become more mainstream. Now you combine that with, of course, another trend that's happening right now because of Corona and the implications that it has on different industries, is that we're seeing a meat shortage. So now all of a sudden you're starting to make connections because you've rehearsed the future, you've been paying attention, you can start to act more quickly on this and understand it at a deeper level. So that is the gift of practicing imagination in order to see the future through the lens of a variety of possibilities. All right, the second big category I want to talk about are skills related to shaping the future. So once we see and understand the map of possibilities, and what I shared with you is by no means exhaustive. There's many, many ways. We've played games to see the future. We've done Mad Libs to see the future. You can practice this just by asking very, very different questions. How do we now shape the future? How do we then make investments in order to bring about the future that we want to see come to life? Here's where we need systems thinking, ethical thinking, civics thinking, entrepreneurial and logical thinking, right? The ability to notice and to evaluate a theory of change, where something might actually have a bigger impact because we were able to see it to get it earlier. So this is about training yourself to understand the difference between an observable event, to understand the patterns and the trends and the system dynamics. And here's where I'll go back to something I said earlier. This is where understanding history through the lens of trends and patterns can really, really be helpful. This is where being someone that is comfortable looking at analogs, to take a look at adjacencies, to understand metaphors, what might happen, so that you could better get a sense of what investment could you make to drive the preferable and how might you mitigate what you don't want to see come to life. And understanding that just because you have an intervention at one level, there might be something much bigger going on here. And of course, for those of you that are calling in from the United States or watching what's been happening in the last week and a half following the devastating news of George Floyd and his death, we are starting to unpack some very important system dynamics of what's happening around institutionalized racism, around police brutality. And we have the opportunity to open up not just short-term fixes, but really investments in the long term to face a history and to shape it towards a better future. I want to share just one example that captivated my imagination a couple years ago. And this is an incredible partnership that emerged at the end of 2017, where Sesame Street partnered with the International Rescue Committee to address a systemic problem that was just at the base of what could have been a long-standing, terrible future. And that was the plight of refugee children, millions of them that had been displaced from their homes in the Middle East, primarily Syria, that were now relocating to refugee camps. And what they noticed, Sesame Street and International Rescue Committee, was that there was an extraordinary amount of humanitarian aid and focus being driven towards the refugees, but that the children received almost no aid, no attention. And thinking like futurists, what they realized, and you should all be thinking like futurists right now, what do we know to be inevitable about children? They grow up. They don't stay children. And we also know from recent studies in neuroscience and learning development that when children experience chronic trauma, their brain development is slower. It impacts their ability to learn, which ultimately impacts their ability to be thriving adults. So they came together to pool their strengths in order to shape a better future, in order to take what Sesame Street has done so well for 50 years, which is to create immersive transmedia learning programs for young adults, not just teaching ABCs, but also teaching social emotional intelligence, to partner with the International Rescue Committee that had boots on the ground, trusted relationships through their NGO partnerships in these areas. And together they created Alan Simpson, which just launched this year after doing a big research project on how to make sure that this really resonated with the local communities. They created new characters. They had programming that, at least before Corona, was being shot there in order to really touch the children and also to bring in the communities as part of the process. I think this is one of the most extraordinary examples of leading like a futurist, of shaping the future. We're seeing this play out not just in areas of global crisis, but also what's happening in technology. And for those of you that have spent time really studying AI and emerging technology, you know that Moore's Law and the doubling pace of technology outweighs our own ability to understand the consequences here. So this is why it is so critical and why we at the D School are really doubling down on making sure that understanding computational thinking is available to all. So we're actually taking some of the core concepts of AI and we're making them available in analog, in a game format, to make sure that all students have access, even if they're not coders, even if they're not comfortable with computer science. We believe, as my friend and colleague Carissa Carter says, that if tech is to work for all of us, it should be designed by all of us. And we have an opportunity to really invest heavily in there. So we've created these like super simple game cards around unpacking what is an algorithm? What is reinforcement learning? What is regression? How would that play out, for example, if you were to visit an amusement park or in your everyday life? What are the potential biases? How might you use that to shape a future? You don't have to code, but you can start to think about how might that shape where you want to go. And all of a sudden, we get our youngest students really projecting out the consequences of this, right? It would be really good for humanity if we could use association to determine how society might better serve others. It would be terrifying if we used regression for profiling. And all of a sudden you get young people saying this, they're owning the pathways. They are starting to see the world differently. They're not just accepting the technology at face value. They're making their opinions heard. All right, the last thing I want to offer. So we've talked about seeing the future. We've talked about becoming critical thinkers to shape the future, where your point of view matters because you've done work on ethical thinking and systems thinking. I want to talk about the importance of sharing the future. Now you all are about to submit your competition plans, which is amazing. This is your gift of sharing the future to this futures community. I can't wait to see them, by the way. And hopefully you're doing it not just in facts and figures, but in story, in communicating in ways that others can understand, right? Visually, immersively, that you are building community along the way. This is a critical futures leadership skill set to learn, right? And here's where we can really dive into science fiction and what it has given the futures community. This is by my dear friend, Jody Medich, who spends a lot of time introducing young people to science fiction to make it more accessible to them, to access their imagination, to imagine futures, but also to share it with others. And this is just an example of science fiction really transforming to science fact. So this is a story of my good friend Kyle Nell, who used to be the executive director of innovation at a large hardware store company in America called Lowe's. And for years, Kyle was making pitches to his leadership team about why Lowe's hardware store, a decades old traditional big box retail store, should lean into technology. And they would say, Kyle, good job. Nice job with the presentation. And he would say, are you going to invest in it? And they would say, no, we're not. So Kyle was getting so frustrated. What did he do? He hired science fiction writers and illustrators and made a comic book of the future. And that was his last presentation, or he was going to leave. They were so enamored by the narrative. They were so enamored by how Kyle brought in Lowe's into the story and human people in the story. It wasn't like people shooting asteroids in space, that within 9 months, they had a working prototype of this autonomous vehicle that was greeting customers to help orient them to what they needed in the store. So what I love about the story is that it's not the ideas weren't really any different. It was how Kyle chose to communicate in order to bring others on board. We could start to see op-eds from the future. And this was a very powerful one that came out early when we were starting to react to the pandemic by Brett Stevens. And the New York Times has a great series called Op-eds from the Future, so much that it inspired us to bring it into our class as well. Love the work that my colleague Meredith Hutchinson is doing, again, in refugee camps. We're working with young girls to help them not just tell the story of their future through the lens of when I grow up, I want to be, but to actually create scenes for them to embody their future selves, where they dress up and they tell the story backwards. I am a doctor. I became a doctor because of what I saw in my village. I became an astronaut because of what I saw as potential for space travel. And by having these incredible artifacts of the stories of their future selves, it allowed them to have a very, very different conversation with their communities, with their parents, in order to then shape their future to say, you know what, if you want to be a teacher, if you want to be a doctor, then you shouldn't get married at 14. You should double down on your schooling. So the ability to tell our future in immersive ways can have dramatic impacts on the decisions we make today. One of the things we do in my class is we have debates from the future. So each week, as we start to investigate a new emerging technology, we ask our students to apply the future's practices on a utopian debate of the future and a dystopian debate of the future. So this was one where we were talking about mining asteroids and what the implications would be. And this is a picture of the dystopian team talking about how they unintentionally migrated another asteroid because of their activity in space, and how that was sort of headed for a disastrous plan towards Earth, and all of the social implications of actually moving towards space. Be curious to see if some of your stories touch upon some of those narratives. All right, what does this mean? This means that you have the ability, and you're already flexing the muscles to see the future, to shape the future, and to share the future in ways that allow us to make decisions today to have a better impact on tomorrow. And I just want to share one final example of where this is playing out for me right now. For the last 9 months or so, I have been working on bringing future skills and design skills to work on behalf of new voters to shape the future of our next president. So we have a big election coming up in November. And what I observed was that this process was messy and opaque and confusing, filled with misinformation and money, so much so that it disoriented and really put a huge divide in young voters that were not able to access the agency that is so extraordinary in the democratic process of voting. So we asked, what if we took a different approach to thinking about how we become engaged voters? What if instead of asking, do you like this person or this person, we went back to say, what is the job of the president? As stated in the foundational materials that our framers created over 200 years ago in the Constitution, and given that job description and given where we are right now, what leadership qualities are most important? But we didn't just stop there in that analysis. We actually then fast forwarded them to the future. And we said, not just what past experience matters, but how might the leadership qualities play out against potential futures? And we created scenarios, these vignettes that included, if you believe it or not, we wrote this about a year ago, a pandemic of a flu-like virus that started in China that shut down other continents. We've taken that out of the program right now because, as you can imagine, of course, that is our everyday. We have a scenario that is about what happens when water infrastructure becomes compromised. What happens if we have a hacking problem with our next election? What happens if we have an environmental disaster? So we ask students to immerse themselves in these scenarios to essentially test out the leadership qualities that they thought mattered for the president, to see how that they might play out. And we had them give press briefings in response to those disasters, embodying the leadership qualities so that others could see what these responses might look like ahead of the actual disasters. Well, you can imagine that the people that have gone through this ahead of the pandemic are foundationally absorbing what's happening right now differently. They are paying attention to the leaders that are leaning in with compassion and care and making decisive action that allows our communities to be safe differently than other responses. They're paying more attention not just to the heads of states, but also to their local governments, whether that be their governors or their mayors. They are essentially, they have rehearsed the future to make them better decision makers now. And we are on a path right now for all the educators on the line to bring this to as many schools as possible. So in the last 6 weeks, we have made this futures practice available digitally. And please contact me if you're interested in learning more about that. Why do I believe in this so passionately? Because I've seen the transformational change in students, right? I used to think I had no say in the future I will live. And now I think I have the necessary tools to shape it, right? Let's go back to that matrix that we started off with. Where are we on the agency scale? By practicing these skills, does it make us feel like that our choices matter differently? Right? I used to think that imagining the future was a gene intrinsic to people like talent. And now I think there are many valuable tools to practice, right? What happens if what shows up as passive participation is really just a lack of exposure, a lack of practice. That's not you, you're leaning in, but let's take this and make it available to everybody. So with that, I want to say a huge thank you for getting up early, for staying up late, for participating in this. I want you to stay in touch with me. This is a way to get involved. And I think we have a few more minutes for those of you that have kept on for questions. And if not, I will just gladly say thank you so much for your time. So April, I'll turn it to you to see if there are any questions that have come in on Facebook Live.
I didn't see any questions. We had a lot of interaction, things that people were appreciating hearing about, a lot of comments, a lot of deeper thinking that your thoughts had invoked. So thank you for inspiring us in that way. I don't see any questions on the Zoom chat either. We'll give everybody a minute. Oh, I see a lot of thank yous coming in.
And one person said, you gave us so much to think about as we look to our future.
That is fantastic. And maybe we'll end by saying, you know, the reason why I'm so passionate about this work, why honestly I'm working harder than ever, is because I believe that the future starts with you. That I believe one of our jobs is to architect hope, to use that ability to see the future we want to see, to make choices to shape the future and to share it with others is our ultimate form of leadership. And I believe it starts with us. So maybe that is a good place to end, to say thank you so much. Good luck in the competition. I am super excited to see how it goes. And April and Elizabeth, I just want to say a huge thank you for inviting me here today to participate.
Well, I resonate the appreciation and thanks right back to you, Lisa. I was extremely inspired when I was able to be in the live audience where you were speaking. And I must say, even though we're virtual, it was equally inspiring and informative. So thank you so much for being here with us. As we have quite a large audience of future problem solvers, I do want to invite everyone to please follow along on Facebook and on our website, making sure you're joining us later. We will have our flag ceremony. We will honor some of the awards that are coming up. We are opening up our global issues competition this evening. We've completed some of our other competitions already. We have some exciting workshops and sessions over the next couple of days. And because we are virtual and digital this year, we're going to be including some audience participation with some of our final round competitions, looking for some fan favorite voting, and most engagingly and collaboratively on our 3D virtual site. Please connect with others there and view the community problem solving projects and see what your colleagues are doing in their communities today. We're signing off now from our inspiring keynote address by Lisa Kay Solomon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good luck, everyone.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.